I didn't know that I made such a contribution to cutting exports of Poland to Armenia. But still, I am very happy that you succeeded. Marek Belka, a colleague of mine, presented the story of Poland. I largely agree. So I have to change the subject. If you have questions regarding Poland or post-socialist transition, please go ahead. But I would like to focus on more general issues. It's good to start with some striking facts. I have a presentation, but I understand that on technical reasons why it cannot be presented. If it can, then I would be very happy to present it, but let me continue. There are huge differences in the standard of living between countries which used to be at the same per capita income. Take North and South Korea. They were equally poor in the 60s, early 60s. And 50 years later, North Korea had 7% of South Korean per capita income. 1 million people died out of hunger. Drastic, even not so drastic, differences have happened between East and West Germany. Poland and Spain in 1950 have similar per capita income. In 1990, we have 40% per capita. Why? This is the basic question of social sciences. Probably the most important question from the practical point of view, human point of view. Pardon? Okay, I give it up. You can send the presentation later if I have it. Now, another striking fact is that if you look at early 19th century, then you see that all the countries were poor, except for the elites. And then the differences have started to grow in average per capita income. So China and Britain were much more similar 200 years ago than until 1970s. And gradually, countries started to grow faster, but gradually. The first country in Asia was Japan, but it was in the second half of 19th century. So why? And the main factor, the main variable, which is responsible for these huge differences in the standard of living of people as institutional system, or institutional regime, by definition, is a collection of institutions in a given territory, usually a country, which can last. It can last even if it is very bad. And this brings me to a very important question. What are the main types of institutional system? And I start with something which lasted for 70 years. It was the Soviet system. Somebody said, well, only briefly. 70 years is a long time. So what was the primary feature of the Soviet system or socialism? By the way, let me make a digression. For many people are in love with the word socialism. This is why they say, no, it could not be socialism. They say, no, it is communism. But this is naive. Some people say socialism exists in Sweden. They imply that socialism is defined by high social spending. But on that definition, the United States is socialist. And all the Western countries are socialist. You know that in the United States, the ratio of social spending to GDP is higher than in Switzerland, is higher than in Canada, etc. So stick to original definition. Don't try to be in love with nice words together, social, etc. So I will use this in the original sense. The primary feature for socialism was a deprivation of people of economic freedom. So replacing private ownership by the monopoly of state ownership and markets by central planning, which meant commands and rationing. This was based on naive anti-capitalistic prejudices, which were very widespread. And this anti-capitalism, which is still very alive, was not based on any definition. It was based on emotions. And to be even today to say, well, I am for capitalism or markets, it's not very nice. Okay, once you deprive people of economic freedom, and introduce a total politicization of economic life. As a result, you suffer consequences. First, contrary to these naive beliefs, such an economy can function only badly. And it turns out to be very visible, a bit longer run. So once you have an economy which is performing badly, how can you maintain such a system? How? By intimidation. So for that, you need KGB. Or you need what was the name of East German police? Very efficient, secret police. You can't have civil rights, because civil rights allow people to protest. And you can't have rule of law. By the way, what does it mean in practical terms, the rule of law? There are hundreds of definitions. But in practical terms, it means that the institutions of the justice system, especially criminal justice system, are independent of the ruling politicians, of any politicians. Otherwise, they be used like courts in Putin's Russia to arrest and intimidate the opposition. You can't have democracy when you abolish the rule of law. Oh, thank you very much. And you can't have democracy. So the expression democratic socialism is like vegetarian hyena. It's absurd, but it's very popular, but because it's based on the manipulation of the meaning of the word socialism. And then we don't have any dialogue. There's no dialogue if you manipulate the meaning of the most important words. Against this background of extremely bad system, which deprive people of economic progress and won't maintain by fear and propaganda. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of socialism was a great event. Nobody really dreamt that it would be happening. I don't know anybody who have predicted, even guessed. I personally, even in the beginning of 1989 in Poland, I have not have foreseen that Soviet Union would dissipate and Poland would be free to do what was impossible to do some years ago, and only 7 months later, I was asked to take responsibility for Poland's capitalistic reforms. So you may have from time to time nice surprises in history. There are many bad surprises, but also some nice surprises. And the solution is be prepared. Just in case, be prepared. Be prepared for the window of opportunity. Now, then we have an unbelievable process of changes after socialism, which initially seemed to go in the same direction, meaning rule of law, political pluralism, market economy, and this lasted about 2 years, 3 years, but then there was a divergence. And very briefly, what was the divergence? Central and Eastern Europe completed the transition until recently. So meaning Western institutions, Western science of institutions. Recently, we have some backsliding, I would mention in a while. Belarus in 1994 had free elections, and these were the last free elections, won by Lukashenko. 10 years in Russia were unprecedented. I think years and years have brought about quite a change. Very, very chaotic, but how could you expect otherwise? And then Putin was elected. There were free elections. He was very popular because Russia started from a very low level, and he gradually tightened the control until the moment opposition cannot win. You may have opposition, but he cannot win. And in Central Asia, more or less similar. Now we have a lot of data regarding. I will show you these differences, but let me focus on what I consider to be essential. We have a lot of research. So there is no need for speculating about outcomes. On economic outcomes, first of all, on GDP growth. We see huge differences, and it's true that cumulative growth in Poland, except for Albania, which has been very successful, has been more than doubled. On the other hand, under recent at least, you have Ukraine, which is starting to catch up, but there are huge differences. And the research shows why. There is not much need for speculation. There are, I think, two main reasons. The first one, which is more important, if you accumulate more positive change, if you move faster to a better system, which is a market system within a rule of law, then economy starts to grow faster if you do not backslide. And in Poland, we have accumulation of changes. I agree with Marek Belka that we started rapidly, and there was no backsliding. There were differences in the progress, but there was a progress. And then only during recent years, we have some backsliding on which were mentioned. And secondly, countries also differ in the extent of shocks, which meant recessions. And that's true that Poland so far has avoided any recession for various reasons we can discuss. All other countries of former socialists have some years of negative growth. Another empirical point is that contrary to certain naive statements that economic progress was achieved at the cost of human suffering, we have a very good data which shows that they go hand to hand. If you measure it reasonably, then there is a progress on education, progress on health, very much. And not only women tend to live longer life. By the way, women tended to live longer life even under socialism, but not men, which poses an interesting question: why? Were women more tolerant of socialism than men? No, men were drinking more. Heavy vodka drinking is not good for your health. Remember that. Okay, so economic progress tends to go hand in hand with what is called social progress on education, on health, etc. At least it is not contrary. But the last point I would like to raise in this introduction, I'd like to leave some time for debate, is this. Good things cannot be taken for granted. It's true not only of individual life, it is true also of the public life. And it's true of institutions. Of course, countries differ in their susceptibility to regression, but every country is at the risk. And I see, if you look at what characterizes liberal democracy, and I would say that two of the pillars are susceptible to attacks. First, economic freedom. Economic freedom means that you have private ownership. You don't have state ownership, or only as an exception. State ownership is the power of politicians to rule by the telephone, by controlling the managers, and you have general laws and not detailed regulations. And finally, your public finances are not fragile because of the pressures. In such an understood, economic growth, to a different extent, is under attack almost everywhere. There are differences in the attack. Look at the fiscal pressures. There are only a few countries in the West which tend to have more or less balanced budget, and there is a return to old Keynesian pseudo phase that fiscal stimulation can substitute for supply-side reforms, which is absurd from the economic and empirical point of view. And regulations. Bad politics tends to avoid general rules and prefers preferences, because then you can pick up the groups who are supporting you. And in most extreme cases, you may have nationalizations under the slogan of natural interest. In this way, 2 Polish banks have been nationalized. And now we have more than 40% of state banking assets under the state controls, which raises the risk of directed credit. of politically directed credit. And this is not a theory. I have a lot of research which shows that this is a genuine risk. So economic freedom has to be defended. It cannot defend itself, and it has to defend it in an organized way. Meaning, you have to have associations of people who believe in the value of economic freedom, not only for economic growth, but if you reduce economic freedom very much, you undermine democracy. If you control the economy, you can't have genuine political competition. So if you don't love capitalism for its primary virtue, support it as a necessary basis for democracy, democratic competition. And second fundament or pillar of liberal democracy, which in some countries is under attack, not so much in the West to my knowledge, but I mentioned Belarus, I mentioned Russia, Hungary, Turkey under Orban, and to some extent Poland, is the rule of law. And remember, the rule of law exists as long as the institutions of the justice system is independent of the politicians. Once they are captured, prosecution, police, courts, you have elections without competition. Because you can frighten, intimidate, and you can use also these institutions to redistribute wealth to your proponents. Finally, the final word is, what has happened in Central and Eastern Europe after this collapse of the very bad system is like a miracle. But miracles have to be defended. And they have to be defended by active citizens. And also, if there is such a thing as a European or Western solidarity, as an expression of common values, it has to be present. Now, whenever it is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, any questions to the honorable professor? Yeah.
Isn't there a danger that by demonizing politics,
By demonizing?
demonizing politics, saying that everything which is political has to be manipulative and dirty and bad. We had 3 national banks in Iceland. They were owned by the state. They were never subsidized by the state. They were all privatized, and they caused irresponsible activities and irregularities, the collapse not only of the financial system, but almost of Icelandic society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, due to the fact that we were independent, I must say that, take the opportunity to thank Poland, because Poland and the Faroe Islands were the 2 countries who were willing to help us in our crisis. Yes, they did. You did. And but back to my point, to my argument, I am a little bit skeptical about the demonization of politics. These Icelandic banks, they were national banks. They were very, I would say, socially responsible. They would give loans to people who lived in difficult areas which the privatized banks were not willing to lend to. As I say, when they had been privatized, they collapsed and took us all with them. So, isn't there a danger of demonizing
I
politics?
think you are discussing 2 separate issues. Iceland, I know from my best students who studied Iceland crisis, so I don't know. But first of all, what does it mean demonizing politics? When I refer to bad politics, I refer to political dictatorships. This is not demonizing, this is stating the fact. It's beyond reasonable doubt that politics in a society should be in a very limited doses and divided. The most important question in social sciences and political sciences, how divide political power wisely? This is a classical question, as you know. From Montesquieu, etc., United States has contributed to that. And we know that the worst crisis, and this is empirical, though are not caused by the markets, I'm coming to that, the worst crisis in the sense of a collapse of the economy happened when there's excessive concentration of political power. Look at Maoist China. 70 people died. Why? Because there was no checks and balances. And Mao Zedong could launch murderous politics. Fidel Castro, not as murderous, he has much smaller scale to experiment, etc. That's the first. So it's not demonizing politics by pointing out what is a danger, a damage to the people when accumulation, concentration of political power is excessive. This is empirical. Secondly, of course, that the private banks happen to be in crisis. But you have to compare frequencies. And then you should not look only at special cases. You should look at studies which have been done, for example, by the World Bank some years ago, which shows that the higher share of state-owned banks, the higher the probability of the crisis. Why? Through meddling in the credit distribution. If you look, for example, at Spain, you have two kinds of banks. One called cajas, another one commercial, normal commercial bank, Santander. You have crisis in most of the cajas. Why? Because they were politically controlled. So even though, and there is a second point, if you dig deeper, why there were problems in some private banks, you may find some wrong regulations. I happen to be in a European Union group, what is called Winesman, analyzing the root causes of the recent financial crisis, and the root causes comprise combination of wrong policies. But then politicians like to blame the bankers, of course, and central bankers like to blame the commercial bankers. I'm not saying they're completely innocent, but one has to dig deeper.
Okay, the last question?
Just to make the point that I am not defending dictatorships.
No, I am only saying that there are two questions, different questions. You raised two different questions.
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I was referring to democratic open societies, of course.
Okay.
You can't have democracy with total state ownership. It's impossible.
Well, there are a lot of things to discuss, especially with you. I hope one day
Well, I
you will be
understand.
recognized as a Nobel Prize winner. That's for sure. You did a lot. You did a lot. Don't be so modest. Don't be so modest. Yes, now